There's a small shaker of salt on most tables you'll ever sit at, close enough to reach without thinking about it. It's one of the most ordinary objects in your kitchen. But there was a real point in human history when reaching for salt on purpose wasn't a habit at all, and figuring out exactly when that changed turns out to reveal something surprising about a much bigger shift in how your ancestors ate. Start with the body itself. Salt cravings aren't some modern indulgence layered on top of human biology. A physiologist named Derek Denton spent much of his career studying exactly this, publishing decades of research, including experiments with sheep fitted with transplanted adrenal glands to trace how the body regulates its hunger for sodium. His conclusion, laid out in his book, The Hunger for Salt, is that the drive to seek out salt is innate and hormonally controlled, wired into hormones like aldosterone in a system called renin-angiotensin, not something anyone has to be taught. Sodium itself is essential. Nerves can't fire and muscles can't contract properly without it, and the body has no way to manufacture it internally the way it can produce some other nutrients. It has to come from outside, from whatever a person actually eats, every single time. Lose too much of it through heavy sweating or a poor diet, and the body doesn't just feel a little off. It genuinely starts to malfunction at the level of basic nerve signaling. So on a biological level, this craving is ancient, built into the body long before anyone called it a craving at all, and it's not optional the way wanting a sweet treat is optional. Here's where it gets genuinely interesting, though. If the body has always wanted salt, why does deliberately eating it, seeking it out, adding it to food, have an actual starting point at all? The answer has to do with where sodium was already coming from. Early hunter-gatherer groups eating a diet centered heavily on meat were getting a meaningful amount of sodium automatically from the muscle tissue and blood of the animals they killed. A body running mostly on meat doesn't necessarily go hungry for salt the way a body running mostly on plants does, because meat itself already carries a reasonable dose of the sodium that body needs. In other words, for a very long stretch of human prehistory, the innate hunger Denton described may have simply been getting satisfied automatically as a side effect of what people were already eating, without anyone needing to go looking for salt as its own separate resource. Then the human diet changed in a fundamental way, and that automatic solution stopped working nearly as well. Agriculture spread, and diets shifted toward grains and cultivated plants, foods that are naturally quite low in sodium compared to meat. That same innate hunger for salt didn't go anywhere. It was still sitting there, hormonally wired in, exactly as ancient as it had always been. But the easy built-in source that used to satisfy it was gone, or at least much smaller. For the first time in a lot of places, actually finding and adding salt stopped being optional and started being something people had to work for. The archaeological record backs this timing up almost perfectly. A team led by archaeologist Olivier working with Gheorghe Dumitroaia excavated a site called Poiana Slatinei in what's now Romania, right next to a natural salt spring still flowing today. Their 2005 study identified it as the earliest known deliberate salt production site anywhere in the world, dating to roughly 6,000 to 5,500 years before the Common Era. Early Neolithic farmers, already living an agricultural lifestyle, boiled the naturally salty spring water in simple pottery vessels until it evaporated down into solid transportable cakes of salt. Fire, water, and patience turned into a genuinely valuable resource. This wasn't hunter-gatherers casually licking a mineral deposit. This was farmers deliberately manufacturing something their new diet no longer gave them for free, running the same evaporation process, cake after cake, at a fixed spot they clearly kept coming back to for generations. That's also a small but telling detail about how different this behavior was from anything that came before. A hunter-gatherer band moved constantly, following animals and seasonal food. A dedicated production site tied to one exact spring, visited again and again over a long stretch of time, only makes sense once people were already living a more settled, farming-based life in the first place, with somewhere fixed to return to and store what they made. Once salt had to be made rather than simply eaten as part of meat, everything about its value changed. A writer named Mark Kurlansky traced this shift across the entire span of human history in his book Salt, A World History, and the picture he lays out is striking. Salt stopped being just a nutrient and became an economic force in its own right, something scarce enough in the right places to be worth trading, taxing, fighting over, and controlling. Trade routes grew up specifically to move it. One of the clearest examples still has its name intact today. An old road called the Via Salaria, the Salt Road, originally traced by Italy's Sabine people, specifically to carry salt inland from coastal marshes, later paved and extended by Rome into one of its major highways, stretching well over 200 kilometers across the peninsula. A road people still drive on, named directly after the cargo that justified building it in the first place. Empires funded themselves partly through salt taxes. Kurlansky even traces a direct line all the way to 1930, when Gandhi's famous Salt March, a protest against a British colonial salt tax, helped kick off the movement that eventually ended British rule in India. A substance that used to arrive for free, wrapped inside a piece of meat, had turned, over thousands of years, into something governments would build entire tax systems around. There's one popular version of this story worth clearing up, since it gets repeated constantly and isn't quite right. You may have heard that Roman soldiers were literally paid in salt, and that this is where the English word salary comes from. It's a great story, but historians tracing it back have found no ancient source that actually says this. The myth appears to trace to a mistranslation in an 18th century Latin dictionary, which got repeated so often it eventually hardened into common knowledge. Roman soldiers were paid in ordinary coin, the stipendium, carefully counted and documented down to the smallest denomination, the same way any modern payroll would be tracked. The word salary really does come from the Latin salarium, and salarium really is linguistically tied to sal, the Latin word for salt. But nobody today actually knows the precise nature of that connection, and it almost certainly wasn't a soldier walking home with a sack of salt instead of money. So when did ancient humans first start eating salt? Not really a single date, because their bodies were already built to crave it, long before anyone would have called it a craving, and long before agriculture ever existed. But the moment people had to start deliberately seeking salt out, boiling it from springs, trading for it, building roads to move it, eventually taxing and fighting over it, tracks remarkably closely with the moment farming replaced hunting as the main way humans fed themselves. An ancient, hormonally wired hunger, quietly satisfied for tens of thousands of years by nothing more complicated than eating meat, suddenly colliding with a brand new plant-heavy diet that could no longer meet that need automatically. And out of that collision came one of the odder inheritances of settling down and farming the land. Salt going from something that simply arrived inside a meal without anyone thinking about it, to a substance worth manufacturing, hauling for hundreds of kilometers, and eventually building empires and taxing entire nations around.